The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey Through Jerusalem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 22. The Star of Bethlehem. Normally, the road between Jerusalem and Bethlehem was busy, especially just before Christmas. Due to the closure of the City of Peace by the Ottoman army and the fact that it was already late in the evening, Holmes and I met only a few pilgrims on the way. Apart from a greeting, we did not arouse any further interest. The approximately 6 miles we had to cover on foot were completed in 2.5 hours, although Bethlehem was still slightly higher than Jerusalem in the southern Judean highlands. And so we arrived in Bethlehem shortly before midnight on December 22nd. "Well, there you go," I joked, although I was exhausted by the violent march. "We reached the place without having to rely on the guidance of a celestial comet." Holmes remained serious. "My dear Watson," he replied, "in our case it is not the Star of Bethlehem that would lead us into the city, but it is the other way around. We have to find the star in the city." I attached little importance to this teaching when we entered Bethlehem. The small town with almost 4,000 inhabitants was unique in Palestine because almost exclusively Christians, mainly believers of the Greek Orthodox Church, but also so-called Oriental Latins, who were close to the Catholic papacy, as well as Armenians, lived here. A little more than 30 years ago, the Ottomans had nevertheless built an unmistakable mosque with a high minaret in a prominent place on the central manger square, almost directly opposite the Church of the Nativity, which is so important for Christians. It was an early Christian building from late Roman times that was built exactly above the rock grotto, which at that time had been located more or less precisely as the presumed birthplace of Jesus of Nazareth. Since it was a sacred place for Christianity worldwide, I thought about how I could convince Holmes to visit the Church of the Nativity, because of course I wanted to see the place with my own eyes and understand it with my own heart and soul. But as soon as we reached the empty manger square, which housed a lively market during the day, from the side of the Omar Mosque, my friend came before me. "We will immediately visit the Church of the Nativity," he announced almost in command, and I had no interest in contradicting him. "Well," I commented, "if you insist." Of course, Holmes saw through me. "We are not here for tourist reasons or even for the purpose of a pilgrimage," he lectured me. "We are still under the mandate of the British government to fulfill the wishes of our Ottoman allies. It's about putting a stop to the zealot Popular Front." "Go for it," I replied with a smile. "Don't let it stop you." My friend was not going to be stopped anyways. The whole town seemed to already be asleep, and the surprisingly small gate to the outwardly quite unadorned Church of the Nativity had long since been closed. "Shall we knock?" I asked, and was about to take action. But Holmes stopped me. "Not at all, Watson," he replied quickly. "We don't want to wake anyone up. On the contrary." With these words, Holmes pulled his professional lock-picking tool out of his coat pocket and began to work on the door lock with a suitable Dietrich. I was deeply frightened. "For God's sake, Holmes," I whispered as insistently as possible, "you don't want to break into the Holy Church of the Nativity." My friend, however, remained unimpressed and said succinctly, "Do you want to see the Grotto of the Nativity or not?" I acquiesced and let Holmes continue. Within 2 minutes he had opened the basilica and we carefully entered. On the inside the church was brightly lit by all sorts of candles and it seemed deserted for the night. "We're lucky," Holmes said. "No one noticed anything." "God sees everything," I returned, but Holmes was not deterred. Inside, the church showed its importance more impressively. It was lavishly restored, decorated with red velvet tapestries and golden cords. There were images of saints and ornate mosaics, and everywhere the seemingly indispensable censers were hanging from chains. Holmes unerringly headed for the central altar above the birthplace, as if he knew his way around here, and I followed him closely. I tried for a little spiritual grandeur, even though we had invaded the church as burglars. The altar marked, in an indentation, exactly the place where the Christian Saviour is said to have been born. Directly below is a small cave that has been traditionally venerated in this sense for almost 1,700 years. Surrounded by marble slabs which also form a semicircular back wall, an opening can be seen on the floor, In other words, a round hole that allows a dark insight into the preserved grotto. When we arrived in front of it, Holmes said, "Go ahead, Watson. We are here. Just look." I was deeply moved and replied, "Thank you, Holmes, for granting me this moment." But Holmes gesticulated defensively with his arms. "I'm not talking about your absurd closeness to God, which you think you feel here," he replied indignantly. "If anyone was born in this cave at some point, it would be at most a Syrian brown bear. No, my gullible friend, please take a closer look at the enclosure of the opening." The circular hole in the marble floor had a silver setting, a metal fitting that stabilized its outlines. A Latin sentence was engraved, "Hic de Virgine Maria Iesus Christus natus est." Here Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary. But the edging extended beyond the opening to the floor plates. It was, at the same time, an ornament that had symbolic meaning. Focused from the center of the opening, the metal fitting had 14 rays, which went away from it and each pointed to spikes. This resulted in a star shape, as I now noticed. "The Star of Bethlehem," I murmured. "Noteworthy. A silver star encloses the opening to the Nativity Grotto. Holmes, when did you notice?" "It was immediately clear to me," Holmes replied, "that the friendly reference of the Geiger brothers had to refer to this place." "And when did you want to tell me?" I began, but was interrupted by my friend. "I didn't want to burden you too early with too high expectations," Holmes said quickly, "although my assumption was, of course, very justified and predictably correct. In addition, one or the other surprise keeps you mentally on your toes. If I serve everything for you, then you lack the opportunities for development. It is always important to me to help you develop as a person." "Thank you, Holmes," I grumbled. "How very considerate and accommodating. However, before I subsequently unnecessarily crush my brain, tell me right away, what are we doing now? The Star of Bethlehem has been found. And now?" "Now we're moving on," said Holmes. The next moment he got down on his knees and climbed into the indentation, to my renewed horror. He did not pay any further attention to the star-shaped enclosure of the grotto opening, but crawled in front of the wall and began to tap it. "What in God's name are you doing?" I asked, but already suspected something bad. "Don't stand there like that, Watson," Holmes answered. "Help me." I sighed, but followed promptly. On all fours, I also climbed over the opening, but threw in a reverent look, which admittedly remained a little enlightening. When I also arrived at the back wall, however, Holmes had already found what he was looking for, a marble slab that sounded like there was a hole behind it when I knocked. "As I thought," he noted. He looked around, and the next moment grabbed one of the sensors to detach it from its suspension. I frowned and admonished my friend. "That's not really what you are going to do, right?" But of course it was. As soon as I had finished my sentence, Holmes was already hammering the lower edge of the sensor against the edge of the marble slab in question. "I thought we didn't want to wake anyone up," I whispered softly, which was completely pointless given the reverberation of the beatings. "Quite right, Watson," Holmes replied, and continued his work of destruction at the altar of the Nativity unabated. "That's why we need to be fast. In a few minutes someone will surely see what's going on here. Then we have to be gone." "Gone?" I repeated. "Where to?" Holmes now pulled aside the successfully loosened marble slab and exposed a narrow corridor behind it. "Get in here," he replied. "Quickly, if I may ask." "Not another tunnel," I whined, but since Holmes had already crawled in, I had to follow him immediately. Behind me, I pulled the marble slab back in front of the opening in the best possible way so that we might not be tracked down too soon. The corridor was narrow and dark. We had to crawl quite the distance. Apparently the passage led to a building opposite. But at least there were no twists and turns in the course of the strange tunnel. After a distance of approximately 100 feet, we encountered an obstacle. "This is where the tunnel ends," Holmes announced. He knocked on the wall in front of him and noted, "Sounds wooden." He turned around awkwardly and kicked his feet against the presumed exit. Twice, 3 times. Then the obstacle gave way, and a ray of light shone into the tunnel. Holmes climbed out, and was the first to stand in a basement room, which I also entered shortly afterwards. What we got to see left us astonished. 3 men sat at a table, and 2 of them were known to us. "Sulla," I shouted, "thank God nothing happened to you." Then I discovered next to him the young settler who had offered us a night camp at the Sea of Galilee. Aaron, have you been kidnapped too? Holmes shook the dirt and dust from his clothes and said, Good evening, gentlemen. We would have taken the front door if we had known the address. Forgive our intrusion into this convivial round. I quickly drew my pistol and pointed it at the third man at the table, whom we had never seen before. We are here to rescue you, I declared to Sulla and Aaron, and you, whoever you are, better not resist and let us go with your 2 hostages. The third man raised his hands and replied, My name is Elias Habash. I own this house. I warmly welcome you. Save your fine words, I replied, gruff, holstering my weapon. You can make your statement when we have handed you over to the police. And now you should get up, slowly, hands above your head. Sulla, Aaron, we're leaving. You are saved. Holmes had watched my actions wordlessly. Now he interfered. He stepped next to me and pushed my arm down with the pistol. Put the gun back in, he said calmly. You won't need it. But I have to keep the kidnapper, the zealot, at bay, I protested. Maybe he's armed too. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, you are misjudging the situation, he announced. Mr. Habash is not a kidnapper, nor are Sulla and Aaron his victims or hostages. No doubt I made a puzzled face when Holmes presented me with these claims. I looked at him in amazement and asked, What are you talking about? If Sulla and Aaron are not the hostages of this zealot, what are they? Holmes folded his hands and replied, Don't you understand, Watson? They are his accomplices.